This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Welcome to this book launch special of the Vickers Crossing podcast. Today, Rob and Kevin are excited to welcome award-winning and best-selling author Brian McLaren as we celebrate with him the launch of his latest book, Do I Stay Christian? A guide for the doubters, the disappointed, and the disillusioned. You will not be disappointed with this conversation, and you certainly won't be disappointed with this book. We welcome Brian McLaren.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We want to welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing podcast is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And my name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest and pastor at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And my name is Kevin George. I am a priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in London, Ontario. And we're joined here on the screen from the very get-go today by Brian McLaren. Welcome to you.
Hey, really glad to be back with you guys.
Awesome. Great. We're so happy to have you back, Brian. We're going to be getting into something very special that's going on today with you, coming up here in just a few minutes. But we want to welcome our listeners back to another episode today. And yes, a special book launch day today with Brian and his new book. We want to thank Brian and the folks at St. Martin's Publishing for including us in this special day today. And the new book is called Do I Stay Christian? A guide for the doubters, the disappointed, and the disillusioned. And we're looking forward to having this chat, Kevin.
Yes, awesome book. We're so excited because we had advanced copies, right? It says that thing that this is an advanced reader copy. So that always gets me excited. And we're very excited to say that God bless Brian McLaren actually put the Vickers Crossing in the book. Mm-hmm. Amazing, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks for the good work you do.
Okay. We want to begin as we do on this podcast, and beyond just the words of a land acknowledgement, to remind us that we've so much work to do to walk in harmony side by side with our siblings in our Indigenous communities. So we acknowledge that the lands upon which we record this podcast are the traditional hunting lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Wakan, Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of creation and vital contributors to our society, and people with whom we wish to continue to embrace truth, even painful ones, and walk towards reconciliation.
And we also want to take a moment and thank our sponsors here on the Vickers Crossing podcast who have been such a great support to us over the last few years. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And a big thank you to Dave Mullen and his staff at A. Miller George. And we say hi to everybody over there today.
Awesome, Dave. And our thanks to Carol Basada over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Why do you go to big box things to get your drugs when you can go get a local pharmacist who will call you up and check in on you afterwards to see how you're doing? She does it to me all the time. And maybe because I'm such good business. I don't know.
Right. And why waste part of your day cleaning the house when you could be reading great books like Brian's book? Because
that's right.
You could call Molly Maid, another one of our great sponsors.
Yeah.
Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And many thanks to Tricia Listar and the staff over at Molly Maid.
Brian, we like to joke that we've got it all covered through COVID, right? So the way it goes is you start with the cleaners and you keep everything clean and sanitary. If that doesn't work, then you call in the pharmacy and you get some drugs to try and get through it. If that doesn't work, then we have the funeral home to look after the rest.
It's the
I had a feeling we were going there.
Anyway.
Well, we are so thrilled today to be here together on the special edition of the Vicar's Crossing. Who's more excited than Kevin and I to take part in another book launch today? I think the only other person that's probably more excited is the author of that book.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Brian McLaren. So another wonderful piece of work that's kicking off today, Brian, and being released to the world. So welcome, and how are you? And how are you feeling on this special day?
Well, I'm thrilled. I've been having so many good conversations only with people who've read the advanced copy of the book since the book just is about to come out. But it's been really rewarding, and you work in writing is a solitary practice, but then to have a chance to talk with people who've read it, and that's it's incredibly gratifying.
Very,
Awesome.
very good. Very good.
I was actually excited to hear a conversation you had with our friend Diana Butler-Bass recently too. Received her email from the cottage, and just a fantastic interview. And we, you and Diana have been so kind to us here at the Vicar's Crossing, and we're very excited for today. Anyway, look, let's get into it. Let's talk about your book. To start off, I thought maybe you might share a little bit about why write this book now. More specifically, you say at the outset of the book that the question, do I stay Christian, is not theoretical for you, that it's a matter of heart, it's a matter of identity, it's a matter of ultimate concern. You say it's something you look in the mirror and you stop to ask that question. Can you say more about why now and who you hope is reading this book?
Yeah, in south of the border here where I live, I know the statistic, and I would imagine there would be similarities and differences in Canada, but in the United States, there are somewhere around 70 million adults who grew up going to church and no longer identify as church going and as Christian. 70 million is a lot. And that is, we're just talking, these are people, alive right now. And the number increases by about 2.7 million per year. This, there's a lot of religious leaders who will put all of the blame for this on those 2.7 million people and those 70 million people. Something's wrong with them, that they're not sticking with the program. But I just know that's not true. And so I wrote this book to help those 70 million people to try to come to terms with why they had to do what they felt they had to do. I want to help the 2.7 million people each year who are grappling with that question. And I want to help the people who are Christian and don't understand why people are leaving. They just feel like, we're nice people. Why are people turning away from us? And so I want to help those folks too. But primarily, I'm thinking about the people who are right in the middle of that decision-making process. They've got misgivings. They're wondering if they can hang in there. And I'm not writing to try to argue them into staying. I'm writing to try to help them make the decision with their eyes wide open. And I hope that the people who decide to stay will be better off for having read the book. In other words, they won't just stay to be the same kind of Christian they've been in the past, but their act of staying will have new meaning and depth to it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like about it is it's not a Christian apologetic, right? Like, it's not like, oh, why are you considering leaving? Let's convince you why it's so good to stay. In fact, I mean, you'd have to argue that if you picked it up and read the first section of the book is very clearly laid out in 3 sections, which is very helpful. You certainly get the impression once you read part 1 that you're certainly not an apologist for here's why you got to stay.
Yes.
Because part 1 is that presentation of reasons that you say are good to say no to that question. Like, here's why I would answer no. In part 2, you give a good and sincere reasons why a sincere yes to do I stay Christian is very good. And in part 3, you focus on the how can people live in whatever their response is to that question. No matter how the question is answered, how can we fulfill our commitment in a good, honest, and loving way? So let's pick up with section 1. If anyone needed convincing, this section that reads about everything from anti-Semitism to Christian violence to Crusader colonialism to institutionalism, white patriarchy, toxic theology, lack of transformation, constricted intellectualism, and on the list goes. My favorite expression is shrinking, wrinkling people. a shrinking ship of wrinkling people, which I thought was pretty good. You outline all the good reasons to say no. I mean, perhaps good is not the right answer, but the legitimate reasons to say no to this. Do I stay Christian? And all of them are great, but a couple of examples which really leapt out at me, Brian, were around Christian violence and colonialism. You write in the book, to state the obvious, Jesus never tortured or killed or ruined the life of anyone, but the same cannot be said of the religion that claims to follow him. Considering how nonconformists have been treated, and this is a word Brian uses in the book, you listeners, he doesn't use the word heretic, he uses the word nonconformist quite intentionally. Considering how nonconformists have been treated, that is to say, tortured, humiliated, and killed, the irony here is truly incredible. I mean, Jesus didn't behave this way, but this is what we see in the wake of Jesus. Particularly as it relates to Crusader colonialism, you write about the doctrine of discovery and everything that's flowed from it, and we're dealing with that a lot here in Canada right now.
Yes.
There was a royal visit this week of Prince William and not Prince William, pardon me, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, and they made three stops. A lot of talk about Indigenous relationships, a lot of talk about British colonialism. I wonder if you can say more about how so many centuries of Christian Crusader colonialism continued. As you say in the book, it's been a clever way of hiding an ultimatum, which is convert, leave, submit, or die. And those are stark. So when you present in that section 1, how does why it might make sense to say no, that little ultimatum of convert, leave, submit, or die just kept ringing out of everything I read after that, because it really sort of is like a pall over the rest.
Yeah. And just to take that, that very stark statement and show how it can be subtly snuck into a conversation.
Yeah.
I was invited to a luncheon a couple of weeks ago, and it was not a religious gathering. And I arrived late, as I often do. And so I had to sit at a table with nobody that I knew. And I'm seated next to this couple, and the woman sitting next to me asked me what I do for a living. I'm a writer. What do you write about? Well, I was a pastor for 24 years, so I write about spirituality and Christianity. And at that point, she's trying to build a rapport with me. And so she says, oh, we need people to speak up about Christianity because we are so persecuted these days. And I to her, and I knew she was trying to, she must have thought she was saying something I would agree with. I said, tell me what you mean by that, because I said, I've got to be honest. I never feel persecuted for being a Christian here in America. She said, well, it's like saying Merry Christmas. They won't let you say Merry Christmas anymore. And I said, look, I don't mean to be argumentative. I said, but I have never had anybody do anything bad when I say Merry Christmas. I said, have you actually had somebody respond negatively? She said, yes, just this year. I said, what happened? She said, I was leaving the local drugstore and they said, Happy Holidays. And I said, Merry Christmas.
Okay,
and the cashier said, we're not allowed to say that. See, there it is.
Yeah,
So I said to her, I said, look, I'm a Christian. I'm a former pastor. I said, but if I owned a drugstore, and I know that some of my customers are Christian and some of them are Jewish and some of them are Muslim, just as a business person, I wouldn't want to impose my religion on them. I'd want to treat them with respect. And so I can understand why a person, as an act of Christian love, would say Happy Holidays. and she looked a little bit shaken up that I would say this, and said, well, I guess I see her point, but she was ruffled. But later, as at the end of the meal, she came to me and she said, thank you so much for disagreeing with me. We have to learn how to disagree in respectful ways. But I just say that to say, in her mind, if you're a Christian, you should be able to assume that everybody else in America is, and if they don't, make sure that they feel uncomfortable about it.
Yes.
So it lives on in less extreme ways.
Right. And so when you like, I mean, the way you lay it out in the book in terms of, the ways that even that word is loaded, but those of us who come from a colonialist ancestry, in my case, anyway, there are subtle ways that it happens, and then of course there's been those overt ways.
Yes.
And then you outline a lot of that. I wonder if you can say more about just how painful, because you wrestle very openly in the book about how it's impacted you in terms of your own journey.
Yes. Well, my grandfather, who lived in Canada for some years, was born in Scotland, spent 40 years of his life as a missionary in Angola. My dad grew up in Africa. Our life was interwoven with missionaries from around the world because of that heritage. And of course, many of the finest human beings I've ever met were missionaries and are missionaries. But I also have to say that many were relatively unaware that they brought their prejudices with them. Their assumptions of white supremacy were never challenged, even though they were living in a very different context. And even Christian supremacy, the idea that they had everything to teach the people they were going to, but very little, if anything, to learn, or this sense that it was their job to critique everything in the country where they went, so that they would show it was inferior and needed Christianity. I have met a few missionaries. I remember one who told me he went to, this was a Central Asian country, he went to Uzbekistan, and he said he went there to convert the people. He said, but once he was there, he found out that many of these people had so much to teach him, and that he found their way of life was a better way of life than the one he went with. And so, but when very, very few of us, and way more in Canada than in the US where I live, but very few of us really understand the history of the doctrine of discovery and what it unleashed on the world. And so I talk about the death toll, which literally is staggeringly high when you add what Christian colonialism did across Africa, Latin America, North America, Asia, Pacific Islands. The death toll was staggeringly high. And on top of that is the life toll, meaning how people were subjugated, humiliated, made to feel subordinate and unworthy and all the rest. And it continues today. And I'm sad to say this, but it has to be said. I am worried. I'm actually worried that the worst atrocities of Christian domination could still be in our future. And that's saying a lot. Right. And that's one of the reasons why I felt it was worth writing these 10 chapters that I know will be painful for a lot of Christians to read. But I just feel if we're going to stay Christian, we'd be better off having our eyes open to things in our past that have been kept from us. And then we can exercise our footprint in the Christian religion to be sure that these sort of things never happen again.
Well, I think that, and again, as it relates to what we've been most currently wrestling with here in Canada in terms of the Indigenous conversation, that death toll and that cultural role that you talk about is so relevant. And I've heard people say to me in the last year or two, I can no longer do it. I can't do it anymore. The more I learn about who we are and what we've done in the name of religion, in the name of Jesus, I can't do it anymore. And, cemeteries at schoolyards, so-called schools, but really institutions of torture where children were starved and beaten. And, these are very, and when I hear people, and as you say, one of the things that I think is most critical and what I love about this section of your book, quite frankly, is its frankness, because I think we have to be honest about what it's like, because I think the new fervor of white nationalism and the religious right is scary. And I think you're right. I'm not sure we've hit the bottom yet. And
and I was just going to say, and I live in a state where our governor has made it a fireable offense for a teacher to tell the truth about our past.
wow.
And so we face this it's as the secret comes out, people are going to work harder and harder to suppress it.
Right.
And I just think churches should take the lead, and many churches are taking the lead and saying, we've got to tell the truth. We've got to have an accounting. We can't minimize it. We have to face it. Just the other day, I was reading that the Church of England was acknowledging, was it for 300 years, Jews were kicked out of England.
Yes.
I'd never known that, even in doing all the research for this book, that's one that I'd never heard about. And so, and they were trying to not minimize it, but acknowledge it. And it has to become part of the story we tell about our past, so that we are humbled by that. And because if we keep denying it and living in our illusions, we'll be arrogant and proud and ignorant. And arrogant, proud, ignorant people are the kinds of people who do these terrible things.
Well, that's right. And we've seen it here. And the first couple chapters of this book, when you pick it up, really speak to that nature of our relationship with our Jewish siblings, our Muslim siblings. And we've seen it with the attack we had here last year with a Muslim family mown down, and just the expressions of anti-Semitism spray painted on, like, it's rising, and it shouldn't be. But anyway, I digress.
But like you say, that's why those voices are so important within Christianity, within those of us that follow the way of Jesus, to use our voices to bring those things up front and talk about them. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because we get into the middle part of your book, where you talk in a lot of ways about why we should say yes, why we should stay Christian. And there was a young gentleman that you mentioned who's a pastor named Seth, that readers of the book will meet. And I wanted to highlight that a little bit. Seth was a church planter who had planted a new community in a very creative and promising Christian community. And you met with him, Brian, and some of his friends. And Seth articulated to you a very real sense of just being exasperated by everything that was going on, even within this community he was in. And I'm going to share a little quote from Seth, and then I'll have a question coming up. But Seth said that I'm so discouraged because what we're doing in our new faith community is working. Everything that you, Brian, write about, we're doing these things and it's connecting with people. And it's hard as hell because people are so wounded by religion and so suspicious of it. It's like a corrupted brand. But he says, I still know people need a spiritual home, what you have called, Brian, a studio of love. And they need that so much. And they're finding it in our community. But he says, I feel like I came along 5 or 10 years too late, because just as we're kind of hitting breakthroughs, it feels like all my peers around me are giving up on the whole thing because of what white Christianity represents in a large world. Exactly what we were just talking about, that so many of his peers are walking away and they're jaded and disgusted. And he says, I feel like people are quitting the marathon when they're only a couple of 100 yards away from the finish line. And every time a person quits, it makes it a little harder for those of us that are here still running the race. So that's a little bit introduction to Seth. But in the book, Brian, you say, from the outset, Christianity is a continuing movement in the sense that it's on a progression. And to be a voice in this continuing movement is to not give in to those voices that gave us all the reasons to want to leave in the first place. That's in the first part. And you write this. If you and I do not stay Christian, if we give up whatever little voice and influence we have inside the larger Christian community, won't we be an answer to the misguided prayers of the religious company of men and their followers who want the rest of us gone? Won't we be leaving them the keys to the bus so they can keep speeding down the same course? Won't we be emboldening them by abandoning our post of creative resistance? What greater damage will the gatekeepers do without prophetic voices on the edge of the inside, calling them And as Richard Rohr says, another great author and one we've all looked to and read, he says, "Won't we be saying to them, okay, you win, we give up, we quit. The field is all yours."
Mm.
So could you say a little bit more about the importance of these prophetic voices that are on the edge? And now is not the time to think that they're not relevant, that these voices are maybe
Yes.
more important now than ever.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so privileged. And I suppose you as podcasters, you have a lot of these folks on your podcast. So, you and I know there are some amazing people out there,
Yeah,
and we
right.
really are having amazing breakthroughs. Something that has become clearer to me just in the last week or so, as I've been doing a lot of interviews relating to the book release, a sentence that I wish I would have put in the book, and it would be this: I think we should expect that the ugly sides of Christianity are going to get way, way uglier, and the vicious and violent sides of Christianity are going to get way more vicious and way more violent. In other words, I don't think we're anywhere near the bottom. And if we're expecting that they're going to start behaving better, I think we're incredibly naive. They're desperate, they're misguided, they've sold their souls to a whole set of assumptions, and they have been whipped up into an anxious frenzy by ignorant or dishonest people. That's not going to change anytime soon. So I also think it is inevitable that more and more people are going to say, that's not the Christianity that I stand for. That's not the Christianity that I think is legit. And I think we're going to see more and more people be emboldened to actually live out a good and healthy and beautiful faith, and to address things that have been left secret for too long. And I just think we're going to see an explosion of creativity. But what that means is we should expect things to get worse and things to get better at exactly the same time. And I think what some of us want is for just everything to get better. I don't think that's what's going to happen. And in fact, I think what a lot of us would be happy with is if everything could get just a little bit better, very slowly and gradually, so nobody gets upset. That's not going to happen.
Sounds like the church.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is the worst is going to get worse. And that is a challenge to the rest of us, to not get just a little bit better, but to say, what is the potential hidden in the seed of the Christian faith that through us could really blossom? So that's what I hope can happen.
Right.
Well, I don't know about you, Rob, but as I read that bit about Seth, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm hearing you now, Brian, like it's so critical to have people alongside, right? Because it's exhausting.
Yeah.
It's exhausting. We have these conversations on here, but then we go right back into our communities, and we have pockets, right? Rob's in a great community out there. I'm in a great one here, but we go hang out with our peers, and boy, let me tell you, sometimes we just had our diocesan synod, and sometimes it feels like Sisyphus, right? It's that.
Yeah, you wonder what people are hearing that we're hearing. We're hearing the same thing, but it's completely different. It's just unbelievable. Yeah. One of the big pieces of news that, of course, came out of the United States recently and it's embroiled in debate now again is the news of the leaked draft from the Supreme Court regarding the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the abortion discussion, which has always been a huge part of Christianity, especially here in the West, where certainly evangelicals have kind of laid claim to that pro-life side of the debate. And I want to be clear, you wrote this book well before this whole Roe versus Wade draft thing came out. So your references to these types of things in the book are, not a response to this news particularly. However, you do bring up the pro-life movement to get us thinking about a larger issue in Christianity, which is an idea that you credit to Nadia Bolz-Weber, that she spoke of, this idea of the cult of innocence. And I was really taken by this because I think it has a wonderful opportunity to, once we see it, to really be redemptive in a sense. And the idea of the cult of innocence is that like there's this formula that there's like an innocent victim plus an evil villain, and that kind of equals the capacity to be able for us to say, hey, I'm just protecting the innocent victim and I'm not responsible for any of the effects that may come to pass, and my hands are off it, but I'm here to make sure that the victim
Yes.
is okay, right? But when we see that kind of cult of innocence taking place in the abortion issue, but it's not really just about that, because in your book,
Yeah.
you're right. The cult of innocence extends far beyond the pro-life movement. In fact, it's hard to find an arena of public life where the innocence formula isn't a factor, providing a fast and easy shortcut to both purity and superiority. And this is another reason to stay Christian in this section of the book, because as you say, it affords us an opportunity to move from the cult of innocence, where we don't want to claim responsibility for anything in God's creation, to move us toward repentance, where we can actually say, I want to be part of the solution, as opposed to turning my back on those issues in tough discussions that we will inevitably find, and as you say, even more so in a broken world, and it might get worse. So can you say more about this power of understanding and seeing this opportunity for us as Christians? Because I really think it's transformative.
Well, thanks so much, Rob. When I was writing the book, that chapter was one of the chapters where I felt like, oh, finally, I've been able to put into words something I've seen and couldn't quite get into words, for a very long time. And I really hope that people will give this idea a chance, because not only did it help me understand what's going on in our world today, but it made me see Jesus differently. It made me see that Jesus was not trying to create, he wasn't calling the disciples to be the people who were purer than everybody else and were more separated from the evil sinners than anybody else. He was leading his disciples to touch lepers, and he was leading his disciples to have dinner with the outcasts, and he was leading his disciples to defend the sex workers from those who want to make them their scapegoat, right? And he was leading people into a completely different way of engaging the social ills of the day. And by the way, you add social media to this, where it's a lower cost of entry of playing the innocence game than ever. And we just start to see, this is it's a big deal in our culture right now. And what I think I see in Jesus, and what I also see just by evaluating what's happening in our country and in our world, is that if we think the way to purity is by shaming our enemies and dominating our enemies and making our enemies afraid of us, our opponents afraid of us, we're never going to get where we want to be. It's just never going to happen. Of course, Dr. King said this, decades ago. He said, really the only way to get rid of an enemy is to turn him into a friend, because and there's so much wisdom there. And of course, he's in many ways echoing Jesus, who said, the way to live in this world is to learn to love your enemies, because even the dichotomy of friend enemy has all kinds of consequences that will not turn out well. And in fact, one of the things that you see is that Jesus is basically saying winning is not the best thing that could happen. Reconciling is the best thing that could happen. Coming to a new place together is the best thing that could happen. And so, this is just seems to me to be a message we really need to hear at this time, especially if we want to call ourselves followers of Christ. And unfortunately, what's happened is that in many cases, the Christian community has simply become a voting bloc that's been won over to various political factions in their desires to win. And we think that we've struck it rich and made a great deal and we've gotten power. We don't realize that we have gained the world and lost our soul. We have sold our integrity. We've sold ourselves out to methods that will always lead to more conflict and harm. And we have abandoned the path that Jesus taught, that actually is a path that has the possibility of bringing us to greater peace. So and people would think the desire to be innocent, what could be more pure than that? But when you say what people really want is a shortcut to innocence, as soon as you see it that way, shortcuts usually don't turn out too well.
Well, and as you point out in the book, they've hitched their wagon to a guy, a former president who, it's nuts on the surface. But a guy who says it's all about winning, right?
Yes.
The
Yes,
formula
yes.
of winning is the whole
his
thing. I don't
promise,
like
yeah.
losers, right? I don't like,
Yes.
I like people who win. Well, that's not the message of Jesus, right? As you
Yeah.
say, it's about redemption. It's about, finding ways to reconcile. And, we just, in the lectionary, we're just Rob, a week or two away from, Jesus in the last Sunday in the farewell discourse saying,
Right.
I leave you with the greatest commandment, which is that you love one another. And this is how they'll
Yes.
know you are Christians.
Right.
It's
Yes.
by our love. And I was reminded of the story of the guy who approaches an Amish man and says, not knowing anything about Amish, and says, are you Christian? And he said, oh, well, that house about a mile down, that's my neighbor. You'll have to ask him.
Yes.
If I'm a Christian, right? Because I'm not the one to answer that. And I fear that what we've got, and we see it here, and there's an election going on in this province right now, and we're hearing those same voices. There's a thing called the New Blue Party where they're talking white Christian nationalism. It's insidious, and it's like, what part of love one another do you not get? Jesus didn't say, as in that intimate moment where he looks at his adult disciples and says, little children, where he gets very intimate and says, little children, here's what you need to know. He doesn't say, he doesn't say, here's the creed, or, here's your abortion rules, or here's your gay rules, or here's your, it's just, I want you to love one another, and you need to do it in such a way that people will know this is who you are. Sorry,
Right.
Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to say, love one another was kind of the old commandment, but he prefaced it by saying, as I have loved you.
Yes, do it. What you've, all those stories that you read.
Exactly. Do that.
Yeah.
Like that T-shirt that's going around that says, Jesus didn't say that.
Yeah. Yes, I got the shirt. It says, is a depiction of Jesus on the bottom. Say, I didn't say that.
I didn't say that.
I didn't say that. Anyway, I mean, I think the thing, I really, both sections of the book, I just think those two first sections of the book really break down the argument I feel inside of myself regularly as a pastor now of 25 years, coming up on 25 years. There are days I could just pitch it all down. And for all the reasons that you outlined in the first section of the book.
Yeah.
At the same time, in the second section of the book, I read all this stuff and I think about, the march we had here last year, Rob, and
Yes.
the ways in which we engage with people downtown on the street, and the work we're doing on this podcast, and ways to sort of elevate the conversation of First Nations and Indigenous people in this country, the ways in which, the sets of the world are planting realities in among us. And then I feel, when I talk to you, Brian, I never want to quit. If I could talk to Brian every morning, I could probably be okay. You know what I mean? But so there is something to be said for the solidarity. We need this, right?
Yes.
More than ever.
Yes. And the sad, and one thing, I don't want to put words in your mouths, but one of the things that's hard is when our denominations show the same polarization that we see out in our country, then you don't feel you can go to your denomination and find, you find the same disheartening struggle there. And I don't know what to do about this exactly, except to say that we all have to create what we might call crisis communities that understand what we're up against, and where when we get together with one another, we've got each other's backs. Right. And I think that was part of Seth's feeling, this feeling like, gosh, the people I set out on this journey with, and he was talking to me about his denomination, and he just felt like so many people were losing hope in his denomination that they were just, dropping out. But we need some people who we say we have our backs. And sometimes what that might mean is that we got to find some friends outside our denomination too.
Imagine that.
Or even outside of our faith.
Yes, that's exactly right. In fact, one of the things that's been sustaining for me over these last 8 years or so is I was invited to become a part of multi-faith leaders. In fact, just today, and I hope you don't mind me indulging this.
Yeah.
But just today, I got an email from a rabbi friend and she just got back from Israel. And when she was in Israel, she witnessed a house demolition where the Israeli government bulldozed the home of a Palestinian family. And she stood with a Palestinian family while her fellow Jews were destroying their home. And she shared several other circumstances. She came back from Israel feeling the same agony I feel, as a Christian here, that people of my religion are doing something horrible. And there's a sense that when she and I and our other friends are together, we provide one another this deep sense of understanding, because she can't feel safe among her fellow rabbis in many cases, because half of them won't get what she's doing, or they might get it, but they won't be afraid to speak about it the way she's speaking about it. So yeah, we do need to come together. And I just know, I know this in the deepest part of my heart. I don't know how to explain it, but when we come together, we feel the presence of God. When we come together with the people who are involved in this struggle together. When I'm with my friends who are pouring their lives out to save us from environmental destruction.
Right.
And I have many friends in that world who are Christian, but I have many friends who aren't. But it's holy work, and they know it. And,
That's right.
And we feel the holiness of it when we're together.
Yeah,
definitely the well we have to go to. But we got to. That's we got to drink from that well as much as we can.
Yes.
Each other. That's what keeps us going.
I don't know if you guys saw, but there was a meme out there on Twitter and Facebook this past week of all the heretics. Speaking of that word, and Brian, you were on there actually, but it was Brian and Shane Claiborne and Tony Campolo. There was like a chart. It was like America's Most Wanted. And Shane Claiborne was elevating this about how he was a part of such holy company, right? That everybody was, that one of these sort of very outspoken, narrow-minded evangelical preachers had decided to warn people about all these bad people. And all I could think as I looked at it, having read so much as you and I, Rob, of these folks that are on there. And now I've had the pleasure, my gosh, and the honor of having people like you come into this space and talk to you, Brian. It's mind-blowing, but it keeps us going. I'm thinking, thank God for the heretics, or the nonconformists, as Brian calls them, because if they weren't there, I don't know I could hang in, right? Like it takes that. Anyway, but getting on to how. But before I talk to getting on to how, I know that the words of Dorothy Soleil in Credo, there were some words that were really critical to you, may not be in the final version of this book, but I wonder if you can share this poem before I move into this section and ask a question. Brian, would you read it for our listeners?
Sure. And this is a shortened version of the poem. The whole poem's worth reading, but I'm just taking an excerpt from it. It's a poem called Credo by Dorothy Soleil, Soelle, if anyone wants to look up the whole poem. I believe in Jesus Christ. Every day, I'm afraid that he died for nothing, because he is buried in our churches, because we have betrayed his revolution in obedience to and fear of the authorities. I believe in Jesus Christ, who is resurrected into our life, so that we shall be free from prejudice and presumptuousness, from fear and hate, and push his revolution onward. I believe in the possibility of meaningful life for all humankind.
I just love it. I've just been actually this past few weeks reading Dorothy Soleil again, because it's just been, again, you talk about those wells that we go to, and I've been reading this. And then when I happened upon by way of one of the drafts of this book, I was like, this is incredible. Like this is, and then from there you go and you talk about from that second section we were just talking about, you move into the third section of the book, which is around how. And you talk about how some people think that leaving Christianity will solve their problems, not realizing that their problems are as rooted in their stage of development as in their religion. And you write about the reverse being true as well, that some atheist agnostics or people of other religions become Christian because Christianity aids in their growth period. But eventually, even though a certain form of Christianity solves the problem of one stage, it can become a problem in another, creating a stained glass ceiling. I love that expression, that impedes future growth or further growth. You mentioned again Richard Rohr, who, by the way, Richard, if you're listening to this, you're the one guy that's not been on this podcast who needs to be on this podcast. But Richard Rohr, who says that he characterizes the first half of life as developing the basic skills of dualism, dividing the world into opposing categories like good, bad, they, them, safe, dangerous, friend, foe, et cetera, right? Dualism helps us form a container or a moral shape for our lives. In the second half of life, you say that Richard is pointing out that we decide how we want to fill those containers. And to do so, we develop new skills, especially the skill of non-dual seeing. And this means, of course, coming to learn how good and evil are often connected like light and shadow, or mixed like metals in an alloy. Would you say more about the importance of inclusion and of transcending these dualisms that we learn early in our lives? Because I think it's so true. As we get older, it's like all of a sudden we realize, geez, these things aren't as as easily parsed as we thought they were when we were 25.
Yes. Well, one way to say it is to say when you're a little kid, when you're a child, you don't know the world, and it's a big world out there.
That's right.
And so you have to trust your parents and other authority figures to keep you alive. And to keep you alive, they have to give you very simple dualisms, like you can eat that, it's good for you. If you eat that, it will kill you. You can play in the yard and have fun. If you play in the street, you'll get hit by a car. Yes. So, those dualisms of safe, dangerous, edible, toxic, those are really important. Yes. If your mother comes to pick you up from school, go with her. But if a total stranger, maybe don't go with that person. So these are really, really necessary. But a lot of people, unfortunately, live in a religious context that keeps them children. It tells them you cannot trust your own thinking. What we tell you is the last word, and we're going to tell you what's right and wrong for the rest of your life. And don't you dare doubt us, or you will go to hell forever. So It creates this situation of a ceiling, and it's more like a prison, isn't it? You cannot have a thought that goes beyond what we say you can think. And it's a kind of totalitarian religion, but it is very appealing to a lot of people, and it has a long history. And a lot of people think it's what Christianity is, and no wonder they want to leave it.
Right.
But what happens as we grow, first, that simplicity becomes complexified. And we might realize, I learned all these things in church, in my Baptist church, but I have these Episcopal friends or Anglican friends, and they have a different set of rules than we do. And my gosh, I have some Jewish friends, and they have a very different set of rules, and some Muslim friends that they have a very different. And then they think, so if I go to that friend's house, here's the rules. And if I go to that friend's house, it's different rules. And we start to just realize life is more complex than the authority figures told us. And then we might come to a stage where we just get really angry at those authority figures for giving us oversimplified information, and then getting mad at us for questioning it. And that's when many of us leave Christianity, because we've only ever encountered those kinds of authority figures. But what we need more and more of, I think, is leaders who aren't trying to keep people in stage one, but want to help people learn what they need to learn in stage one, and then move to stage two and stage three. In other words, to move toward maturity in an unending process of growth. And I think that's one of those areas that we could be closer to than we realize. Yeah. But we've got an awful lot of history that the only forms of Christianity that were available to people were stage one or stage two, in that dualistic way of seeing the world. And the truth is, there are more and more of us who are moving beyond that, and there's room for people in that space. If we want to stay Christian, we can live in that different space.
Exactly. So we're coming to the end of our time. I want to jump a little ahead to the, not to give it all away, but you conclude the book with a wonderful chapter that's called Stay Human. And in this section, you articulate that there's a new question of human identity that is emerging for all of us. And it's a question that really now overshadows old questions of religious identity. Like who are we as human beings? What kind of humans do we want to become? To be or not to be better humans? That's the question. And among the questions you ask are these, and I'll share a little bit from the book. You ask, will we be wasteful, consumptive destroyers of this earth? Will we be hateful, competitive warriors battling in group against in group, religion against religion, nation against nation, ideology against ideology until the bitter end? Will we fail to learn from the hindsight of history? Will we refuse to exercise the foresight of imagination? Will we only succeed at being short-sighted, living for the next paycheck or the next election? Will we be addicted to certainty and blinded by our unchallenged biases? Will we think that converting everyone to be Christians just like us, or converting everyone to be whatever just like us, will suddenly solve all of our problems? And do we really think that any of us have being human really figured out? Might all of our other identities struggle simply be proxy battles about this deeper question of what kind of human we want to become and humans we want to become? And there's wonderful theological reflection that follows around biblical images that are evoked when we ask this question. So I thought, just as we wrap up our time, Brian, would you share a little bit with our listeners, maybe a little of that reflection? Because really, this is incarnation, isn't it? It's how we become more human.
Yeah, as I wrote this book, it just became clear to me, and of course, I guess it's obvious to everybody, that the struggles we're having in the Christian faith, we're having in the Canadian government and the American government and the British government and the Russian government.
Yes.
And the struggles we're having in the Christian faith, our Muslim and Buddhist and Jewish friends are having, and atheist and humanist communities are having similar kinds of struggles. And the struggles we're having in the Christian community, we see parallels in business and in education and in science. And then you just step back and you realize, the whole human project is at an inflection point.
Yeah.
And the thing that is so evocative to me about this is that, as I say at the end of the book, Jesus didn't like to call himself the Son of God. Other people called him that, but the term he called himself the most often is the Son of Man, which I think is a way of him saying, I'm a new generation of humanity. I'm trying to show you a different way to be human. Yeah. And this becomes this interesting opportunity where the question of, do I stay Christian, becomes less relevant than the question, do I want to become the kind of human that Jesus was?
Right.
And oh my goodness, if a person says to me, I want to become the kind of human Jesus was, I don't really care whether they do it with the label of Christian or not. I'm just happy that that's the kind of human they want to be.
Well, it was Gandhi. How was it Gandhi put it? I rather like your Jesus. I just haven't found many who are his followers, who are something like that, who are actually living like that. And I think the Common English Bible, that translation that came out about 10 or 15 years ago, they have changed the turn of phrase "Son of Man" to "Human One."
Yes,
in its translation, and I think it's really. I think you're bang on, Brian. Is that when I read the last part of the book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly the way we need to be talking about this. It's about the incarnation. If the incarnation means anything, it's about how we become better humans. How do we become better human beings? How do we live in relationship with the creation around us and with one another? And, all this brokenness, as you say, I fear it will get worse. But voices like yours, which continue to be a well for those of us who want to be better humans and who want to find ways to encourage others to be better humans. Your voice is so critical. And I mean, and because of what you're writing, I think many people will pick this up and maybe this is the permission they need to let go of the church and go on to something else. Maybe it's the permission they need to stay. Or maybe it's just permission to continue to engage that question because it's not time yet to make that decision.
Yeah.
But you've given that opportunity with this honest reflection. It's an incredible book.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And can I just say, I feel this way every time I'm on this podcast with you guys. I'm just so grateful for you. I feel that podcasts are one of the main places where this conversation is happening. And it's especially safe for people who've been part of religious communities that don't give them freedom to think and talk and converse freely. And so please keep up the good work. And for all the folks who are listening, we're all in this together. This all has value as each of us find ways in our town or city, wherever we are, to live it out. It ultimately is a matter of how we live.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Brian, for those generous words and your support of us. And the book's out this week, folks. Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned. Look for it where you buy your favorite books. And to all our pastor friends listening, and we know they never admit it to us, maybe, but some of our clergy like to listen to this podcast.
Yeah, they do too. They just don't tell us.
They do. This is your new book study, and I know I'm going to be getting on that in my parish. And
Amen.
Looking forward to sharing this with so many others. So, Brian, God bless. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, my friends. We'll see you down the road. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, and again, our thanks to Brian for being so generous with his time on this very special book launch day. Do I Stay Christian is the new book, so we certainly encourage folks to get out and go to the well, as it were, and drink, my friends, drink.
Yes, I think, Rob, and to certainly to colleagues who are listening to this, I think that this is the sort of thing that when we sit down with parishioners and talk about it, we're going to hear more and more people who have these internal debates going on. And who would be heartened to hear that we have these internal debates going on as leaders in the church. Right. And someone like Brian, who's given so much to the church over the last 30 years, is having these sort of internal dialogues. So I just think that there's such a great potential to have really open, honest conversation that will allow for growth in who we are as the body of Christ.
Right. And if people aren't comfortable, I say this all the time to folks in my parish, if you're not comfortable feeling in a vulnerable space with other parishioners of the church or even with your pastor, but you have a friend or a relative or something, you talk about this, create that safe space at home or on Zoom or whatever, and do this work, and because it is a well that you can drink from, and
Amen,
to have hope and work forward, and it's so important. So please consider that. All right, we want to thank our sponsors today, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Kevin, thank you so much. Wonderful chat with Brian, and we'll look forward to welcoming Ian back next time around.
Yeah, we'll have to find out what life was like in Corinth. I expect Ian to come back like a biblical tour guide or something.
Oh,
he's in Greece, and when he comes back, we hope that we'll learn all that there is to know about the people of Thessalonica, Corinth, and anywhere else that he may have visited.
That's right. I can't wait to hear all about it. That'll be great. So thanks to Brian again, and to all our listeners. We appreciate you joining us again. We'll look forward to chatting down the road on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross that street.